What's up, guys? Welcome to this week's Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions. And also, as always, if your question doesn't get answered in this video, then you can just go ahead and copy and paste it onto the bottom of this Patreon post. Also, don't forget to post any new questions that you have on this Patreon post. And also, please like all the questions that you want answered so that I know which questions have the most demand. So with that said, let's jump right in. So Anime Godfather asks, thoughts on the return of Khatzumoto? I don't think much of it, to be honest. To fill people in on context, so Khatzumoto, the creator of AJATT, I used AJATT to learn Japanese, and I was a very strong supporter of AJATT for a very long time. He pretty much stopped regularly posting things on the internet a very long while ago, really right around the time that I was actually getting into learning Japanese in 2011, 2012. He already had mostly stopped regularly posting things on the AJATT website. And in that time between around 2012 and the present, he's had short stints of reappearing, posting for a few months, and then disappearing again. But particularly these last few years, he's really had close to no internet presence. Now, I think around 6 months to a year before I created my Patreon, Khatzumoto created a Patreon out of nowhere after having really posted nothing on the internet and started creating Patreon-only articles. And then I think later he would release those articles to the public as well. But really, they were just rehashing the same ideas that he'd been talking about this entire time, things about productivity and how to approach intimidating tasks and immersion and things like this. It really seemed to be nothing new. It also seemed like they were relatively low effort articles. It seemed like he would just sit down and kind of put some random thoughts on the page without really refining it too much and then just put it up there. And then he kind of stopped doing that last year as well and had really posted close to nothing. And then around a week ago, he randomly posted on Twitter saying that he's back now and he's going to be creating new content. And so far, he's created 3 Patreon posts and also a couple tweets. And so, yeah, I guess this is what is being asked about. What do I think about Khatzumoto's big return? Well, like I said, he's had small stints of reappearing only to disappear again multiple times in the past many years. So if I had to take a guess, I would guess that within a few months he's going to just disappear again because he's going to realize that he's not very interested in doing this and it's not very lucrative to him anymore. And so, yeah, I'm guessing that this probably isn't really going to last, especially considering that so far all he's done is release Patreon-only posts. Now, Khatzumoto doesn't have a lot of patrons. Last time I checked, he had around 50 patrons. And so, obviously, that can't be too lucrative for him. And he only seems to be creating content behind a paywall, which kind of tells me that he's kind of only interested in making money. And also, if you actually go and look at those posts that he's created, they're actually videos. They're extremely low-effort videos. Like, it really looks like he didn't put very much thought into them at all. He kind of just turned on the camera and rambled about a certain topic, and they're really all over the place. And so it really just seems like he isn't really motivated to create high-quality content to help people out with their language learning. He's just rehashing the same ideas that he has been for the past 10 years in a very low-effort, unrefined form and putting it behind a paywall. From my perspective, it kind of looks like he's just trying to see if he can squeeze some more money out of whatever hardcore fans he still has left. But, hey, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he's going to start releasing more high quality content and he's just getting warmed up. Maybe he's going to be posting things on the AJATT website as well and not only post things behind a paywall, and maybe he'll be here, in the long term. And so if that's the case, that would be great. If he is really motivated to try to contribute to the language learning community and help everyone improve their experience and results with language learning, I think that would be really great. I think he has the potential to bring a lot of wisdom to the table. I think he's really good at helping people remember the importance of having fun, not taking things too seriously, and some other of the more motivational and emotional aspects. I think he can do a really good job of emphasizing those things. I especially think it would be cool if he'd be willing to, have conversations and collaborate with, myself, other people in the community, because so far he kind of seems really kind of stuck in his own AJATT hole. And what I mean by this is that if you watch the videos that he's put out, he's using all this AJATT terminology that most people aren't even familiar with, like MCDs and MXDs and multiplexing and all these concepts that he introduced right at the end of AJATT, and I don't even think most people are familiar with or remember anymore. And he's assuming that you're using Sarusu, which is his own SRS that he made, which is a complete piece of garbage and a complete mess. I tried to use it. Just go look at the website. It's actually laughable how ridiculous this piece of software is. But anyway, yeah, he's just assuming that everyone is on the same page as him and has read all his articles and is using his software, and he's not really willing to meet people halfway, it kind of seems like. And so from that, I think that's a little unfortunate. I hope he's willing to change that. I hope he's willing to kind of update some of his views to accommodate for all the new technology we have, all the new ideas that have been introduced, and try to create something new instead of just saying the same exact old stuff he's been saying forever. But yeah, I mean, if you want to hear more of my thoughts on AJATT, there's a podcast that Yoga and I did up on his channel, the Yoga Mat Podcast, which I'll put a link in the description to, where we talk about AJATT. I mean, it's hard to really... I was about to say it's hard to say bad things about AJATT. Clearly, that's not true, because I just said a bunch of bad things about AJATT, and I said a lot of bad things about AJATT in that article. But I think I'm kind of biased because, of course, I used AJATT to become fluent in Japanese, and if it wasn't for AJATT, I probably wouldn't be where I am today. So I'm always going to be indebted to AJATT and be thankful to Khatzumoto for creating it, because it had a really positive impact on my life when, all was said and done. And at the same time, because I was so religious about following Khatsumoto's advice, now that I've kind of snapped out of that, and I look back on all the ways that Khatsumoto's advice harmed me, there is some kind of negative emotion there. And so when I think about AJATT, I think I get extra harsh to it because of that. Because, a lot of times the most intense followers become the most intense detractors once they kind of swap over. And there's actually like kotowaza in Japanese that basically means just that. Can't remember exactly what it is, but I'll put that in the description as well if I remember to. And so, yeah, I mean, and there's also just the fact that MIA kind of branched off of AJATT and is extremely similar to AJATT in many ways. And so, of course, I have the desire of wanting to differentiate myself from AJATT and really be doing my own thing. I have a desire to be recognized as someone who's doing their own thing, who's not just copying someone else. And so I think all of these make me very biased towards kind of talking down to AJATT. So take everything I say with a grain of salt, but those are my thoughts on at the present moment. So Matt A asks, what are your thoughts about Luca Lampariello? I just realized I don't really know how to say his name. It's an Italian name. Lampariello? Luca, Luca the Polyglot. Everyone knows who he is. If you hang around the language learning YouTube sphere. So what do you think of Luca's recent video on his failure with Japanese? Where do you think he went wrong? How would your strategy differ from his? Where do you agree and disagree with him? So, yeah, I guess I just said everyone knows who he is, but I shouldn't have said that because that's an assumption. And if you don't know who Luca is, he's one of the more accomplished YouTube polyglots. I think he knows at least some degree of 13 plus languages. I think he said 13 in the video that is being referred to here that I just watched. And I'll put a link in the description to that video as well. And some of those languages, apparently he speaks very well, like at a near native level, particularly multiple European languages like Spanish and French, I think. But I can't really verify that firsthand because I don't know those languages. But he really seems to be one of the more legit polyglots who is actually at a high level in multiple languages, instead of just having dabbled in a bunch. So he made a video recently talking about how his biggest failure in language learning was with Japanese. He never really reached a level where he could do meaningful things with the Japanese language, and now that it's been some time since he originally studied it, he's lost most of what he had. Whereas with other languages like Chinese, although he's still really rusty because he never uses it, he still reached a level where if he wanted to pick it back up, he could catch himself back up to speed pretty quickly. And so he really thinks of it as a skill that he has acquired. Whereas in the case of Japanese, he never reached a level where he was able to do meaningful things, and so he pretty much just lost it all when he stepped away from it. And so in this video, he's talking about his analysis of what went wrong and what he wants to do differently next time when he eventually picks Japanese back up in the future. And the first thing that he really says is that he thinks the issue is that, well, he seems like he was very focused on output right from the start. So of course that clashes pretty heavily with MIA philosophy, but he was trying to output from the start, and he says that he ran into trouble because Japanese syntax is so completely different from Italian and English syntax. Italian's his native language, and he's also pretty much native level at English. That when he took this strategy of essentially thinking in Italian and then trying to translate that into Japanese in real time, the syntax was just so different that this strategy completely failed him, and it would take him a really long time to be able to say anything, and he would feel like he was solving equations in his head, and he just kind of got burnt out. And so that was the first thing that he said that really didn't work for him. He also talked about how he failed to create an immersion environment or to go to Japan. He says that if he never has been to Japan, but he thinks that if he would have went to Japan and really had a chance to directly interact with Japanese culture, that would have created a lot more passion and motivation, and that would have helped him continue on past the difficult beginning initial stages of learning Japanese. And even if he didn't go to Japan, there are a lot of Japanese people where he lives, or at least around in Europe, so he still could have gone out of his way to make more of an immersion environment, and that would have helped with his motivation as well, but he didn't do that. And then he talks about the solutions, and part of the solutions he talks about how the resources that he used were not comprehensible enough. So this time he wants to try to get more input through more comprehensible sources, and that also he wants to start outputting by speaking in very simple sentences and then building up over time instead of just trying to say fully fleshed out sentences that are too difficult to, translate in real time from Italian into Japanese. So, I mean, he's learned a lot of European languages, and because all European languages are pretty much very similar to each other, at least compared to like Japanese or Chinese, I can see how outputting from the beginning would be more feasible and cause less issues. But when it comes to learning Japanese, I mean, obviously, if you have seen any of my content, you know that I think that it's better to put off outputting for a certain period of time and just focus on input. And so I agree with him that part of his problem was that he was trying to output it from the beginning and do that through thinking in Italian and then translating in his head. If you've watched my content, you probably know I think that that's an awful idea and it doesn't work. So, of course, I can see why that didn't work for him at all, and it just led him to get frustrated and eventually give up. And I can imagine that the solution that he came up with, which is only speak in super simple sentences at the beginning, I can imagine that would improve the situation to a decent degree. But ultimately, the issue that he ran into was that Japanese syntax is completely different than Italian syntax, and so he couldn't think in Japanese because he didn't have any Japanese infrastructure in his head. Now, if you speak English and you're trying to learn Italian, you can use a lot of your English infrastructure because they're so similar in the end, right? So you can just benefit from that English infrastructure in your head and still somehow maybe translate in real time and think in Italian. But with Japanese, it's just so different. You have nothing to rely on. Your native language doesn't help you out at all. And so you're really just not going to be able to speak. It's not going to be very feasible. You're going to be trying to solve complicated equations in your head, and it's not going to work. And so the true solution to this is to have through getting Japanese input and comprehending Japanese input, you allow your brain to reformulate itself so that it can function in a Japanese way, so that it can understand and manipulate Japanese syntax directly and intuitively without having to translate or do anything else. And so he's saying he's going to try to build his way up to this through output, but I think it's better to just do it through input. That's really what we do in our native language. He was trying to make this argument like, oh, well, Japanese children and children of any, native children of any language, they start with simple sentences and they build their way up. And that is true, but they don't start speaking simple sentences until they've already gotten immense amounts of input and understand huge chunks of the language. So that's the real start, I think, right? Is through input, you learn to understand, and through learning to understand, your brain is reformulating itself so that it can function in a Japanese way, or, whatever the manner of whatever language you're learning. And so, of course, there's kind of that clash. And then he says that he thinks he would have benefited from creating more of an immersion environment. I totally agree with that. He says he's going to try to find more comprehensible input. He was using Asimil. I don't know that much about Asimil or Asimil for Japanese, but he said he would find more sources he can input with. I think that's a good idea as well. But really, yeah, the core difference is Japanese is so different. You're not going to succeed in speaking Japanese without reformatting your whole brain so that it can function in a Japanese way. And I think the best way to do that is through input. That was my experience. And I can imagine that perhaps he never ran up against this barrier because he mostly learned languages that were more similar to his native language. Although he seems to have had a decent amount of experience or a decent amount of success with Chinese. I don't know the details of that. But anyway, those are my main thoughts. So Scott Scrum asks, "Hey Matt, I'm a psych student in my 3rd year, and I was wondering if you or Yoga have looked into doing research on aspects of language acquisition to help get more people to acknowledge that immersion is the best way to learn. Obviously, all or most of our experiences with MIA prove the method to work, but I mean in a more academic journal ready published type of research." Yoga and I have just kind of, talked about this in the abstract, like, oh yeah, maybe if we get rich one day, we could do our own research and we'd conduct studies like this and things like that. But whenever we talk about that, it's like I just said, in a very abstract, like, oh, maybe one day, wouldn't it be cool if type of way, not in a let's do this right now type of way. And that's mostly because we already have our hands full with all the things we're doing right now. And to do really good research, you'd need to have a huge budget. And obviously we don't have that type of money right now. And getting some kind of grant to do that type of research sounds like it'd be really difficult. And running a good study, designing and running good studies and following through with that whole process pretty much sounds like a full-time job, or at least a part-time job. And we are already have our hands completely full, like I said. And so that's not a priority right now. Maybe if we will do that in the future, if we finish creating all the content that we want to create and we end up with a bigger budget, maybe we'll worry about that. But really, I don't think that that's the most productive way to just spread immersion learning among the populace, because there's always been a huge gap in what science understands and what the general public understands. And I've listened to or read in a book about this particular topic, and there were a lot of examples. Unfortunately, I don't remember where it was, like where I even learned about this, but I remember consuming some piece of educational content that was going into how we understood science understood certain things that didn't catch on in the general public for 50 years later, or things like that. And there are a bunch of examples. So even if we scientifically proved exactly how one can learn a language most efficiently through immersion, that wouldn't really necessarily help spread immersion learning among the populace, because everyone already has a preconceived notion about how language learning works, and they're not going to instantly change that. And companies like Duolingo and stuff are spending a huge amount of money on marketing to feed people ideas that are counter to that. And ultimately, that type of marketing is going to probably have a bigger effect on the populace than what some scientific journal says about something. And ultimately, like, I watched this really good video on pop science. If you type in pop science, I'm sure you can find it on YouTube. And it's just kind of talking about how most of the science that everyday people who aren't scientists hear about is kind of created and targeted towards the general public, and it doesn't really reflect what is really being talked about in true academic journals. And the reason for this is that true science is very complicated. There are a ton of details you need to understand in order to really be able to follow along. And in order to keep up with that, you basically have to be a full-time grad student. So what pop science is this kind of watered down, dumbed down version of the current ideas of science that are fed to the public. And a lot of times they might not necessarily reflect what the science actually says, because a lot of stuff can get lost or warped in this process of watering things down. And he had a lot of, in this video I'm talking about, I'll try to put a link in the description. There are a lot of examples of how, he particularly talked about some TED Talk about procrastination and about how procrastination is actually helpful or a good thing. And I haven't actually seen this TED Talk, but I know I was recommended it a bunch of times. And he talked about how the scientific studies that was based on have not actually been published yet. They were just like some preliminary result from some research and later on it turned out that they couldn't replicate it, so it never got published. Yet the whole general public or anyone who watched this TED Talk probably just believed that, okay, cool, science said this, so now it's a fact, So proving things through science is a very long-term, difficult, process that's not necessarily straightforward. And even once that happens, getting it to the public is, again, a whole different thing. And so ultimately, I think that the best way to get immersion learning to the public is through doing what we're doing now, making lots of videos, explaining it, having other people make videos explaining their experience and how it worked for them. And it seems to be working pretty well because immersion learning has been growing a lot, particularly thanks to people like Steve Kaufman, I think is doing a lot in that area. And so, in our minds, of course, it would be ideal to be able to prove what we're talking about through science, but that is kind of an indirect path to spreading these ideas. And so it's not a priority, and it's not really something we're going to do until we have pretty much already created the main content that we want to make and have a much bigger budget. So Louis DeBrat asks, "Hey Matt, I was wondering if you could give us a more detailed account of your beginnings with output. I'm curious if you really literally went from never speaking Japanese to sounding completely fluent, or if there was a transition period, no matter how small. What did it feel like outputting in the beginning? Did it feel like you had to speak awkwardly at first, either having to correct yourself often or simply having to pause mid-sentence to think, etc., before you got used to the actual act of speaking? I find myself struggling with this myself and can't figure out if the problem is that I need more input or if I need more training on the battlefield before I can get it out faster. 95% of the time, if I'm writing/texting, I have no problem expressing myself, but speaking in real time still trips me up. Another way to ask the question is this a Japanese issue, or is there a meta skill unrelated to Japanese that I need to train? Thanks in advance." So let's see. I have to, recall my experience because it's been quite a while now since I initially learned Japanese. But I've told the story in the past about how when I was around 2 years into learning Japanese full time, I had the opportunity to guide Japanese people around my town and talking to them. And so basically, up until that point, I wasn't speaking at all. I was just getting input all the time, but never really speaking. And then I had this opportunity to guide Japanese people around town. And when I went and did this job, I found that, I can speak Japanese pretty much fluently to these people. I can understand what they're saying to me, and I can express all the things that I want to say. And so in a way, it was very 0 to 100, as they say in Japanese. I wasn't speaking at all. Now, of course, when I was in Japan, I was speaking every day. But after I came back from Japan, I spent pretty much an entire year not speaking any Japanese. And also when I was in Japan, the Japanese I was speaking was very broken because I hadn't had enough input yet. And so in a way, I went from never speaking at all, literally, because I literally never spoke Japanese. And then I was able to speak. Now, after this, I went back to pretty much never speaking again. It wasn't like I was like, okay, cool, output's a thing now. And then I started speaking on Skype all the time. It wasn't really what I did. I pretty much just went back to getting input all the time, but I had this one data point that let me know, oh, I can speak Japanese, at least decently, like AJATT worked. And in that experience, I wasn't great. Now, I mean, I can't really remember exactly how good I was because I didn't have a recording. I don't have any recordings I can listen to now to verify exactly where I was at, and I couldn't accurately self-judge how good I was because I was only as good as I was, right? Like, if I looked back now, I could, it would be easier for me to tell when I was making a mistake and when I wasn't, and so on. So it's hard to really quantify how good I was, but I know that I was able to, like, basically when I was speaking, I was not thinking in English. I was thinking in Japanese the first time and saying what I wanted to say. Now, I'm sure that a lot of the time I had to compromise, like I couldn't necessarily say exactly what I wanted to say. Instead, I had to say what I knew how to say that was close to what I wanted to say. And so maybe I couldn't fully express myself. And a lot of times I would, if I had a moment to think, I could output at a much higher level of quality than if I had to really speak right off the cuff. So if we were like walking in a group and there was a few moments when no one was saying anything, then I could, formulate a more complicated or more accurate sentence in my head and then say it. Whereas if someone asked me a question and I instantly had to respond, I probably wouldn't be able to be as articulate, and the quality of my output would drop. And I'm also sure I made a lot of mistakes, a lot of grammar mistakes, or just saying unnatural things or using collocations wrong and things like that. I'm sure that happened a lot as well. And so I was by no means perfect, but I could communicate and do everything that I had to do. And so in a way that I did go from no speaking at all to being fluent in Japanese, but you have to, everyone has a different image of what it means to be fluent. And so I wasn't at an extremely high level. Like, for example, if you watch the video of other recent people who've done MIA and started outputting, like if you watch Chris's video, I interviewed Chris. He made a video where he just speaks Japanese for, I think, close to a half an hour. It was at least 15 minutes. And in that video, that was one of the first times he had ever spoken Japanese before. But he can express everything that he wants to say. He's quite fluent. He's way better than many people who have a degree in Japanese. And but of course, he still makes mistakes. He still says unnatural stuff and things like that. So I imagine I was probably at a similar level to that. And there are other few videos of people speaking Japanese after doing MIA, and they're in a similar situation, right? It's they don't output on the regular. This is one of the first times they've ever spoken, but because they've had a critical mass of input, they can speak the language. Now, they might be kind of slow, they might be kind of stumbling, they might be making mistakes, but they can express themselves, and you can tell that they're not thinking in English and translating. They're thinking in Japanese the first time, and they're saying things that they've heard native speakers say. Even if they kind of mix some things up, you can tell that they didn't just learn what they're saying in a textbook and that they're just doing translations in their head. So I think, I can link some more of these videos of people speaking Japanese for close to the first time after doing MIA for, 18 months or 2 years or 3 years. And you can get an idea of this is what it looks like when you first start outputting. Now, as you continue to get input, the quality of your output will continue to rise even if you don't practice. So for me, like I said, I had this one instance where 2 years into learning Japanese full time, I had an opportunity to speak. I was able to speak. I was successful in communicating, even though I still made a lot of mistakes and had many limitations and so on. But after that, I spent another year pretty much doing nothing but getting input, actually more like probably another year and a half, doing nothing but getting input. And then I went to a 4-year college. At that time, I was going to community college, and there were no real Japanese people at my community college. But then after I was around 3.5 years into learning Japanese full time, I transferred to a 4-year college. And by the time I got there, I was much more fluent than I was at that 2-year mark. That additional year and a half of doing Japanese close to full time made a huge difference. And at that point, I was able to express myself very freely, make relatively few mistakes, and it really just felt more like I've reached a new level, like a level that a lot of people never reach in their Japanese, even if they live in Japan for many, many years. And I got better the more that I spoke, but at that point, it really did kind of seem like I was able to reach a pretty impressive level of output, even with close to no output practice. It was really just through input. And so it's because of this experience that I'm such a believer in the power of input, right? I was able to reach a level of speaking ability that people who speak Japanese every day sometimes never reach. You know, foreigners who live in Japan and speak Japanese every day never reach, just through input. And so there was that. Now, I of course got a lot better through practicing, and I would stumble less. Like I got better at just speaking more quickly and pronouncing things faster, and it became more effortless. And I started to have more experiences where I would forget that I was even speaking Japanese or speaking a foreign language. It would just seem like I'm just having an interaction with another human being, where language wasn't an issue. But yeah, I think I was able to reach a pretty good level just through input. So chances are, at the point you're at now, you can, if you just continue to get input, you would continue to get better. But also, if you went out of your way to practice output more, you could get better at output as well. So there is this kind of point where, like, there eventually will come a point where input alone will not improve your output anymore. But this point is pretty far down along the line, and I would wager that you haven't reached that yet. Now, you don't have to wait until that point to start practicing output. You can start practicing output long before that and improve your output abilities pretty quickly. But the way that I basically formulated in my mind is that first, there's a period where outputting will not be fruitful. It won't be productive because you simply don't have enough Japanese infrastructure in your mind. And so you're basically going to be stuck doing what Luca was doing, that, like I talked about in the last question, where he was just thinking in Italian or thinking in English and translating it. And that's not productive. It doesn't lead to true ability. So first, there's this period, which is like stage 1 and 2 of MIA, where speaking is just realistically off the table. Then you reach this next period where speaking becomes more feasible. You have enough Japanese infrastructure, or, target language infrastructure in your mind where speaking is productive. And if you do practices to improve your output, like just speaking a lot and recording yourself and watching it back and getting feedback from native speakers, and then inputting while paying attention to the specific things you want to improve on. And so through active effort, you can really improve your output and get better and better. And so this is that middle period. But while you're in the middle period, even if you don't do any work on your output, just through getting more input, your output will continue to improve and get better and better. And then you reach this final stage where eventually you get to the point where getting further input will not improve your output, or maybe it will, but it'll be so slow and such small improvements that they're almost imperceivable. And to improve your output further, you really have to start actively putting effort into improving your output. And so once you get to that middle period, or for the duration of that middle period, it's really up to you whether you want to put all your effort into comprehension ability and input, or if you want to start splitting your effort between improving your comprehension ability and improving your output at the same time. And this is going to be depend on what your priorities are, what your preferences are, and what your life situation is. Like if you're living in Japan or living in a country where they speak the language you're studying, obviously it's going to be a higher priority for you to be able to learn how to speak. For me, I was living in the United States and I didn't have any Japanese friends, so speaking was a really low priority. And just personally, I valued comprehension very highly. And so I just continue to sink all of my experience points into comprehension until I reached that point where the only real way to improve my output was actually speaking. And for me, that worked out really well. But other people, the idea of not speaking the language for 3 years and only getting input, a lot of people, that just sounds completely ridiculous and they'd never be willing to do that. So for them, it's more a matter of, people who are just interested in speaking the language. It's more a matter of racing to the beginning of that middle phase I talked about, where practicing output becomes productive, and then they can start splitting their efforts between growing their comprehension and growing their speaking ability. So I would say that you're probably in that middle period now, where if you start speaking, you will continue to get better at speaking, but even if you don't speak, you just get input, you'll continue to get better at speaking at what you'll get better at speaking as well. But of course, your output abilities will improve more quickly if you actually put active effort into that. So it's really a matter of your priorities in terms of how you should spend your time. And in the end, you said, is this a Japanese issue or is there a meta skill unrelated to Japanese? And this, I don't really understand how that relates to the other things that you said. Because if you can speak your native language, then there's no meta skill that you need to acquire that you haven't acquired yet, right? There's no meta skill related to speaking a language that you don't have if you can speak any language at all. So, and I don't really, you say another way to ask the question is this a Japanese issue or is there a meta skill unrelated to Japanese that I need to train? I don't really see how that is a rephrasing of the other things that you asked. It sounds like a completely different question. It sounds more like you're asking, do I need more input or do I need to practice speaking Japanese more? And I would say, I guess both ultimately. But I don't really get how meta skills relates to what you're talking about. I don't think that's your issue. I think your issue is, like I said, if you had even more mental infrastructure related to Japanese, which you would build through input, that would help you. If you just practiced using what you currently have, that would help you as well. And so it's ultimately a Japanese issue, I would say. Yeah. Okay. So Asflug asks, what were some moments you realized your vocab might have surpassed the vocab of the average native? So yeah, I mean, I can't remember one exact pivotal moment, but it's basically the type of experiences of, like, for example, watching a Japanese TV show with other Japanese people or watching a movie with other Japanese people, and then hearing one of my Japanese friends asked what a certain word means, and I already knew that word. Or using a word that I felt was relatively common, but realizing that the other person doesn't know that word. Like, you know, I'd say, oh yeah, that's so blank. And they'd be like, what? And then I'd be like, oh wait, oops, did I pronounce it wrong? And I'd say it extra clearly. And they'd be like, what? And then I'd be like, oh man, did I mess up the pitch accent or something? And I'd pull it up on my phone and in the dictionary app on my phone and show it to them. And they'd be like, I've never seen that before. And so that happens way less often because now I'm much more careful about making sure to only say things that I'm sure are super common. But, and when I am going to say something that might be uncommon, I say it differently out. Like, for example, a lot of times there'll be a kotowaza that's perfect for the situation, but I imagine that, you know, a lot of Japanese people don't know that many kotowazas, so they might not know it. So instead of just saying, oh, this is, you know, blank, 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 I say, wait, don't they have a phrase for this? I think it's, like, blank, 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 blank. And then they'd be like, oh, really? I've never heard that before. And so instead, I don't say it as if I'm assuming they understand it. I say it as if it's something that's uncommon and they probably don't understand. And then I don't sound as pretentious and stuff. But anyway, that was kind of a tangent. Let's see, other moments. Having Japanese people look at my Anki cards and realizing that they don't know like 9 out of 10 of the words that I was learning. Just watching Japanese TV and watching Japanese YouTube videos where Japanese people are interacting with each other and having one of them ask the other one what a word means, and maybe they both don't know, so they have to look it up or something like that. But these are all words that are kind of like common to me. And also just like there were also times where I was trying to read a Japanese book and I would, you know, not know what a word means or not remember how a word is read. And I'd ask my friend and they would never know it if I didn't know it. And so these were the kind of experiences that made me start to think, man, what if I know more words than a Japanese person? And then I started to really pay attention and I would ask Japanese people more. Like, there'd be more situations where there'd be a word that was pretty rare and I'd ask them like, hey, do you know what that means? And they wouldn't know, even though I would know. So once I started to really get the idea that maybe I knew more words and I wanted to really confirm that for myself, I started kind of probing them more and asking them more and paying more attention. And that was when I was able to see like, oh wow, the average person's vocabulary is a lot smaller than I had previously imagined. Because I would read novels and things like that, and I just had this idea that natives understood 100% of modern day novels, when in reality, for most people that aren't avid readers, there's going to be a lot of words that they don't know in novels. And I learned all of those relatively uncommon words, not all of them, but I mean, I learned many uncommon words that Japanese people don't know. And so, yeah, let me see, are there any other times? I mean, there were other times where like Japanese people would get really interested in the fact that I seemed to have a large vocabulary, and they'd start trying to test me, and they'd Google on their phone like rare kanji or like super hard kanji readings, and then they'd quiz me, and I wouldn't know all of them, but I'd know a lot of them, and there would almost never be a time where there was one that they knew but I didn't, but there would be many times where I would know it but they wouldn't. And so just through those experiences as well. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question. Slaman Bagori asks, "Hi Matt, I'm halfway through RTK 1 and I'm doing 2 hours of active immersion and 5 hours of passive immersion. However, my problem is when I'm watching shows in raw JP, I can't tolerate the ambiguity, so sometimes I enable English subtitles and disable them after I understand what has been said in the scene, and then I rewatch this whole scene in raw Japanese. You should use a period there, not a comma. This is kind of hectic. Any thoughts on how to combat this?" So I would just view the ability to tolerate ambiguity as a skill that you can train. So if right now, like let's say the ability to tolerate ambiguity is between 0 and 10. So if your ability to tolerate ambiguity is 0, then every single time that you come across something you don't understand, you feel a strong compulsion to pause, rewind, turn on subtitles, ask a native speaker, just get clarification, or you simply can't move on. And level 10 is where you could spend an hour watching something, understand 0% of it, and, that's no sweat. That's totally cool. Because you know how to entertain yourself in other ways, like paying attention to the sounds, or to the scenery, or to the facial expressions, or any other number of things. So it's not like you're just born with a certain, ability. Like some people have 3 on this scale. Some people have 6. Some people have 9. It's not like that. It's that most people start out relatively low if you grow up in Western society, because everything that we're kind of indoctrinated with throughout our childhood pushes us in the direction of not being able to tolerate ambiguity. We're told that not understanding is a very bad thing. It means that you're stupid. It's important to understand. You have to master one thing before moving on to the next thing. So most people start out relatively low on this scale, but you can raise your ability to tolerate ambiguity as you go on. Now, the ability to tolerate ambiguity doesn't mean that you don't care about understanding. It doesn't mean that you never stop and spend some time trying to understand something more, but it means that whenever you do so, you're not doing it out of a compulsion. You're doing it because you've made the rational decision that that's a good use of your time. And so it's not just like if you have 10 tolerance of ambiguity, then you just zone out and never learn anything. It's your ability to tolerate it. Just because you can tolerate ambiguity doesn't mean you're always going to make 0 effort to understand. Like I said, it just means that you have the ability to make a choice instant by instance, instead of feeling the compulsion that you need to, that you're kind of describing, like you feel like you need to turn on the English subs. So first, I would just accept that whatever your ambiguity tolerance is, that's where it is. It's totally fine. Try to gradually up it over time. So maybe sometimes there's a scene you don't understand and it really just kills you. You're like, oh my God, I need to know what's being said. Whereas other times it's more like, okay, I really want to know what's being said, but it's not as strong as it was in other cases. So maybe first try to find some situations where before you would have turned on the English subs, but maybe just this one time I'm going to let it go. And for those times where it's really difficult for you and you really have a strong desire to turn on the English subs, and those times you can still do it, but just try to start raising your standard for how strong your compulsion has to be before you're going to turn on the English subs. Or maybe you can make rules like, okay, at the beginning, once a day, I'm going to not turn on the English subs, even though before I would have. And then besides that one instance, every other instance, you can turn on the English subs. And over time, once that becomes easy, you can make it 2 instances and 3. And over time, you can gradually reduce the amount of instances in which you turn on the English subs. So basically, I would say instead of, trying to go from 0 to 100, just start wherever you are now and try to make gradual improvements in the direction of tolerating more ambiguity, and you will naturally build up your ambiguity tolerance muscle, and it will become natural for you to not look things up or not turn on the English subtitles. So that would be my recommendation. So Robert Whittaker asks, is reading through AJATT and Antimoon still beneficial to learning MIA? So you said, is it beneficial to learning MIA? I wouldn't say it's beneficial to learning MIA in particular, but I'd say it's beneficial to your language learning process, probably, yes. So if you are someone who's learning a language through MIA, I would say that, yeah, reading through certain parts of AJATT and through Antimoon are most likely going to be beneficial to you. Now, with Antimoon, you can read through Antimoon's whole table of contents in a day or two. It's relatively short, and there's a lot of good stuff in there, and they explain things in a lot of useful ways. And so I would say that you, at some point, or maybe slowly over time, it would be a good idea to read through that. AJATT, on the other hand, has a million articles, and there's a lot of fluff in there and a lot of repeat content and stuff. So trying to read the whole thing is not going to be a good use of time. But if you just read through the AJATT table of contents, maybe, skimming through some of the stuff that feels more like fluff, I would say that would be beneficial, particularly on the mindset and motivational aspects. Now, of course, there's going to be certain points where AJATT and I clash in opinion. And of course, I would recommend that in those cases, you just follow my advice, because of course, I recommend you follow my advice. That's why I give it. But of course, you can slowly form your own opinion, maybe on one certain point where Khatzumoto and I disagree. You feel like Khatsumoto's point of view resonates with you more, so in that case, you can go with that. And, it's just nice to have different people's perspectives on the same topics and get more different, ways of, hear different people explain the same ideas in different ways. It can help you understand it more. And so, yeah, I wouldn't say it's required, but I'd say it's likely to be useful to read through parts of the AJATT table of contents and through Antimoon. And if you want to read through the AJATT table of contents, you have to actually Google for that, because it's buried deep within the site. So if you want to find it, just Google AJATT table of contents and you can find it. So Marcus asks, not related to language learning, but Japan in general, do you know what the cultural reasons are for the future population decline in Japan? Based on current demographics, age period, fertility rates, no immigration, etc., the UN predicts the population of Japan could shrink from 126 million to 80 million by 2100. Like the year 2020, I don't know you'd pronounce what the normal way to pronounce that's going to be by the year 2100. Is this something that's being talked about in Japan? So first of all, yeah, this is something that's talked about in Japan all the time. It's called shoshika, or shoshika mondai, which means shoshika. So yeah, it's like the reduction of children epidemic is essentially what it's called. And you hear it talked about all the time in Japanese society. Like, you hear people make jokes of when some guy is being a wuss and so he can't get a girlfriend, they're like, oh yeah, it's because of you that the shoshika is happening and things like that. But it's also talked about more seriously if you watch debates about between Japanese intellectuals about what Japan should do in the future. They're always talking about how we need to address this problem, about how most people say they don't think that the government is doing enough to address this issue, and what the other causes of the issue are, and things like that. So yeah, it's a very hot topic within Japanese society, because they're kind of screwed if they don't find a way to do something about this. Because one result of the population shrinking is that the percentage of the population that is going to be elderly people is going to massively increase. And of course, elderly people can't meaningfully, like when they're really elderly, right? Like when they're like 80 plus, most people aren't going to be able to meaningfully contribute to society. And they're kind of just a burden on society because they need to be taken care of. And so a lot of Japan's resources is going to be going towards taking care of old people, like a relatively large proportion of the resources. And that's going to put a big strain on all of society. And there's already a lot of people think that the social security system is going to totally break down because of this. And, ultimately, if the population shrinks forever, then it'll just go extinct, obviously. But yeah, there's a lot of other more short-term negative ramifications of this. And ultimately, I don't know very much about the topic or whatever. So if you're interested in this, definitely go listen to some expert opinions and don't trust what I'm saying. But yeah, what are the causes of this? I mean, there are a lot of potential causes that are thrown around. But I think that it's really hard to say which of these causes are truly contributing in a large way and which ones are more kind of having a minor effect. And, I think even experts disagree on this. So why would I, who's not even a sociology expert or whatever, have an expert opinion? But I'm not even relatively that educated on the topic. Like I'm for all I know, maybe there is a consensus among Japanese intellectuals. Or sorry, just among sociologists, Japanese or otherwise, about why it's happening. So I don't really know, but I think that a big part of it might just be related to economics. Like right now, Japan's not doing very well economically. Japan hasn't really experienced any economic growth in the past long while, or at least, I don't know the details, but I hear people say a lot that at least the rate of like Japan's economic growth is extremely diminished compared to other first world countries. And, ever since the bubble popped in like the late 80s, Japan's economy was doing very poorly for a while. And it seems like they still haven't fully recovered from that. And it seems like the government took some really unhelpful strategies for trying to deal with that had further negative effects and so on. So I think, yeah, generally Japanese people aren't doing very well financially. And I think that when you're not doing well financially, it's hard to decide that you want to have a kid because that's a huge burden and a huge cost of money. Like having a kid in Japan costs a lot of money because you have to send them to most people want to send their kid to a good school, and private schools cost a lot of money, and you have to send them to college, and you have to feed them, and you have to, just costs a ton of money to raise kids. I think in most first world countries, but at least especially in Japan. And so the fact that people aren't doing well financially, I think is a direct cause, is direct cause to people having less children. Now, there's a lot of people saying, like, if you interview Japanese people, like, oh, I'm not interested in having kids. I just want to live my own life and live freely and have time for my hobbies and not have extra burdens. And, but I think that might just be a way that people rationalize it to themselves, the fact that they don't feel financially secure enough to have a kid. Because, that's also maybe true to a certain extent, but I would wager that if Japan was doing better financially, a lot more people would be having kids, and there'd be less people giving, kind of stringing this story about how the reason they don't want to have a kid has nothing to do with money. It's just they don't want to for other unrelated reasons. I think, because when people aren't happy about a current situation, they have the tendency of rationalizing it to themselves that, oh, actually, they're just choosing to do that. It's not that they can't. It's that they don't want to, because that's just a lot easier to cope with. It's very difficult to cope with the reality that you can't do what you really want to do due to circumstances that are outside of your control. So, that would be my guess. And, there's also the issue that I talked about social kudanshi, which is this Japanese term that literally means vegetarian boys. And it's this kind of, it's the way to talk about how a lot of Japanese males nowadays have kind of become more feminized and less masculine. And these type of people, oftentimes they don't really go after girls. They don't really get girlfriends or get married. Instead, they just spend all their time and energy on their hobbies. And so there's just a lot less dating that's happening, a lot less people having sex. And so because of this, there's less children. So that could be a part of it as well. Only I don't know if that's playing a more minor role or a more major role. I think it's hard to say. But I was just listening to this one Japanese podcast the other day, and they had this sociologist on, Miyadai Shinji, who I really like. He speaks very harshly about Japan, modern Japan, and a lot of the problems that they're facing. And he was talking about some statistic where, like 20 years ago, or maybe 30 years ago, I can't remember, 60% of Japanese college students were like sexually active. But now only 30% of Japanese college students are sexually active. So it's been reduced by 50%. And he was talking, he had a larger narrative he was kind of stringing about the causes for this. But one of them was like, that their guys are much less aggressive when it comes to girls. They're, afraid of making a fool of themselves or being rejected. And so instead they just avoid those issues altogether. And he thinks, it stems from being raised in a overly sheltered environment and never being put through any hardships, so they don't know how to cope with emotional difficulty and things like that. But again, these are just all stuff that I've heard, so I don't really know how valid they are or what the reality is. But what I do know is that it's definitely a very hot topic in Japan, and if you're interested in learning more of that in Japanese, there's probably going to be no shortage of content related to that. As long as you Google or YouTube search the Shoshika Mondai. So yeah, I'll type that in the chat, the name of the issue in Japanese. So Thomas Donovan asks, this might be more of a question for yoga, but I'll try asking here anyway. Can you explain how the catch-up feature of the new schedule optimizer add-on is different / better than simply setting a maximum number of reviews per day in Anki's default system? So yes, I can explain this to you. Yoga and I designed the add-on together, so I understand pretty much exactly how it works. In short, these two things that you're talking about, the catch-up feature in the vacation add-on and setting a maximum number of reviews at Anki, are completely different. They're almost opposite. So yeah, Anki has this built-in feature where you can set a limit of how many reps you do per day. So if you go into the option group settings in Anki and you go to the reviews tab, I think it's the first option on the top. When you first download Anki, it's set to 200. So what this does is, no matter how many cards you have that are due in a given day, Anki will only show you the number of reviews that you set in this setting. So, like I said, by default, this setting in Anki, the maximum number of reviews per day is set to 200. So what this means is that even if there's 300 cards in your Anki collection, which are scheduled to be reviewed today, instead of showing you all 300, Anki's only going to choose 200 and show you those 200. When you do the 200, it's going to say you finished all of your reps for today, even though in reality there's still 100 cards in your collection that should be reviewed, or at least Anki thinks that today is the day that they should be reviewed, but you're actually not reviewing. So let's just say that you're learning a lot of new cards every day, and so on average, 300 of your cards at any given time are scheduled to be reviewed in a given day. So if you had no max number of reviews per day, on every day on average you would have around 300 reviews. So we can imagine that this person who's learning, let's say like 30 to 40 new cards every day, and they have 300 reviews every day, if this person set their max number of reviews per day to 200, then every single day they're only doing 200 reviews, which means they're getting 100 reviews behind every single day. So if they repped after repping for 10 days, they'd be 1,000 reps behind, and they're never catching up. They're just forever getting more and more behind. So let's just say that, because it sounds like you're comparing this to the catch-up feature. So the catch-up feature in the vacation add-on is for when, let's just say you were sick for a week, or you were in the hospital for a week or something, and you missed out on all your reviews for an entire week. You come back, you have like 600 reviews waiting for you, and it's to help you catch up and take that giant mountain of reviews and bring them back down to zero. So let's say you're in this hypothetical scenario where you were in the hospital for a week, you weren't able to do a single review, you come back, and then 7 days worth of reviews are waiting for you. So let's just say that in this scenario, you normally have around 100 reviews a day. And so when you come back from 7 days of no reviewing, you have 700 reviews waiting for you. Or let's just say 6 days of no reviewing plus the current day. So 700 reviews waiting for you. So if you just set the maximum number of reviews per day within Anki to 100, then you do 100 of those, and then the next day, and so then after you do that 100, you still have 600 that you really should do. And then the next day, you have a new 100 reviews for that new second day. You do those, and then you still have the 600 you've never done. And basically, you have this 600 reviews that you were supposed to do, and you just never do them. They just are constantly there. You're constantly behind, and you never catch up. And this is going to start affecting your retention rate very badly, because Anki is not just going to save those 600 reviews. Instead, it's going to feed them to you, and so, okay, this is kind of hard to explain, but so let's keep going on with this scenario. So like I said, every day Anki gives you a new 100 reviews, but you're also behind 600 reviews. So what's going to happen, it's not like Anki takes these 600 reviews, puts them to the side, and then gives you the new 100 each day. Instead, it's going to put the new 100 reviews for that day to the side, and it's going to give you the first 100 of the ones that you were behind on. And so if you do this, you might not be able to follow along with this if you're bad at math, but basically every single day you're going to review 100 cards that were supposed to be reviewed a week ago forever. And so since you're always reviewing your cards 1 week later than you should, your retention rate is going to get very negatively affected. And so basically, yeah, what I'm trying to say here is that if you use the max number of reviews per day setting on Anki, you're not catching up. You're permanently staying behind, and this is going to have negative effects for your retention rate. So what the catch-up feature does in the vacation add-on is, so let's take the scenario again. So you come back from the hospital, you have 700 reviews waiting for you, and what it does is it takes these 100 reviews and it reschedules them into the future. So what the feature lets you do is choose the pacing at which you want them to be spread out into the future. So let's say you want to do 10 reps a day for 70 days. So what this is going to do, it's going to take these 700 and it's going to reschedule them so that every day for the next 70 days, that's a lot. So maybe we say you do 20 reviews a day for the next 35 days instead. So for every day for the next month, the next month pretty much, you're doing 20 more reviews than you would have done, because it's going to add these on top of your other reviews. And then for that day, you have 0 reviews because you just rescheduled every review you had that day. So now, instead of having to do 700 cards in one sitting, you're slowly spreading that 700 over the next month, which lets you catch up more painlessly. So now like I said, in this scenario, you have 100 reviews a day. So now for the next month, you have 120 reviews a day. But after that month, you'll be fully caught up and it'll go back to 100 reviews a day. So you're actually catching up. Every day, you're trimming away at that stack of 700 cards and getting closer to being fully caught up. Whereas in the first scenario that I talked about, where you're setting a max number of reviews, you're literally never chipping away at that mountain, and you're always that much further behind. So that's why this feature is cool, is it actually allows you to get caught up without affecting your retention rate. Now, of course, since I said you're going to take those 700 reviews and schedule them over the course of a month, by the end of the month, you're reviewing cards that you should have reviewed a month earlier. And so, of course, on those cards, your retention rate is going to be a lot worse. But at least for the 100 cards that you review every day, the new 100 cards, those you're seeing on time. And so your retention rate's not going to be affected. And the other thing is that Anki, when you use this catch-up feature on the vacation add-on, it doesn't randomly spread your cards out throughout the next month. What it does is it takes the cards with the smaller interval and it shows you those sooner. So let's say out of those 700 cards, you have some cards that have an interval of 3 days, and you have other cards that have an interval of 5 years, and then everything in between. So on the first day, it's going to show you all the cards that have the 3-day and 4-day intervals, and then the day after that, it's going to show you the ones that have the 5, 6, and 7-day intervals, and it's going to go gradually until by the time you get to the end of the month, you're going to be seeing the cards that have the intervals of like 4, 5, 6 years. And the thing with this is that the longer the interval of a card is, then the less likely it is that you're going to forget it, even if you surpass the Anki interval. So for example, like if a card has an interval of 3 days, that means that you just learned it and the piece of knowledge is very unstable in your head. So, or unstable, I think, yeah. And so if you didn't see this card for a month, it's very likely that you would forget it. But if you can go 5 years without reviewing a card and still remember it, you could probably go 5 years in 1 month as well. You know what I mean? It's like the larger the intervals get, the more kind of random or just imprecise they get in Anki anyway. And so you can afford to kind of wait an extra month or two, and most likely you'll still be able to remember it. So because the catch-up feature of the vacation add-on schedules cards with smaller intervals first, your retention rate is going to be minimally affected, although of course it probably will to at least some extent. So, okay. I always get to way less questions than I think because I spend a lot of time on them, but I think that's probably for the best. So let me see. Let me choose one more question for today. Or how about I'll try to do 2 more quick ones. So Kamaztaz asks, what's the story behind your most viewed YouTube video? Why do you think it got millions of views? What are the characters talking about? I don't know Japanese. So yeah, so if you actually go to my YouTube channel and you sort all my videos by how many views they have, there's one video that is like 19 seconds long and it has over 2 million views now. And so that's way more than my second most viewed video, which I think is my RTK video, which has less than 100,000 views. So the deal with this video is it's a clip from the original Pokemon anime. And what's happening in the clip is that it's 3 characters. It's Ash, Misty, and then this third guy. And this is in the Orange Islands season. And so it's not Brock. It's the guy who temporarily replaced Brock. I don't remember his name in English. But it's the 3 of them, and they're sitting down and they're about to start eating. And so Misty is complaining about the food that they're going to eat. Because it's that middle guy. I can't remember his name. Let's just call him Tristan. So Tristan is normally the guy who cooks all the food. Just like how Brock was also the guy who cooked all the food. So she's complaining about the food that Tristan made. And she's like, what? Fruit sandwiches? This is lame. I want to eat something better. And then Tristan is like, hey, but these are good for your health and they're tasty. And then Ash is like, if you're gonna complain about the food, why don't you just make food? Why don't you make the food yourself then? And then Misty is like, what? Like, but making food is for boys. Like, that's the boys' job, is to make food. And she just says it like it's a matter-of-fact thing. Like, what? Girls don't make food. Boys make food. And then both Tristan and Ash make this super surprised look on their face. Like, what? And then there's this sound effect like, boom. Like, what the fuck? And in reality, the reason they did that is because right at that moment, a giant Snorlax appeared right behind Misty. And so they're like, oh, crap, a Snorlax. But I took this clip from Pokemon, and I cut it off so that the clip ends with Ash and Tristan just looking super shocked. So if you just watch the clip, it looks as if they're reacting to what Misty said instead of to the Snorlax. So what's really happening is they don't care what Misty said. They're just reacting to the Snorlax. But what it looks like is that they're like, what? You think that cooking's for boys? No, cooking's for girls, obviously. What are you talking about? Are you crazy? That's what it looks like. So that's kind of the joke. And then I titled the video, like, Kasumi no Mondai Hatsugen or something, like Pokemon, like Misty's problematic statement. I titled it that. And so I think the reason why it got very popular was because most people probably assumed that Misty was going to be saying something sexual, or she was going to be saying something that could be taken in a sexual way, and that was going to be the joke. Like, she was just like, like, oh, I love like long sticks or something stupid like that. That really she was talking about something related to the episode, but out of context, it looks like she's saying something like kind of sexual. Most people probably thought it was going to be something like that, and so they clicked on the video. And it's a Pokemon video. It's really short. Probably piqued a lot of people's curiosity. And so I think that's why it got a lot of views. And also, views on YouTube is a very random thing, right? No one really fully knows how the algorithm works. So if a video gets a lot of views, then the YouTube algorithm is going to recommend that video to more people, and then more people are going to watch it, and then it's going to get more views. So the way that videos go viral on YouTube is kind of in this positive feedback loop. It's like there's this snowball effect. And so any video, even if it's stupid, can get lucky and get sucked into this positive feedback loop and become a viral video. And I think this just happened to happen. And if you read the comments, there's a lot of comments in the video where people are basically saying like, oh, who came here from this other video? And actually there's this other kind of Japanese meme where Brock is like, Team Rocket does something, and then Brock yells at the people like, "Omaera ningen jane!" And he's basically saying like, "Yeah, you motherfuckers aren't even human." And for whatever reason in Japanese, it just sounds super harsh. Like he's saying like, "Wow, you Team Rocket, you're like scum. You're below human." And it just sounds kind of out of place for Pokemon because it's such a harsh thing, and Brock says it in such a like harsh way. And so that one little clip just became a meme. And so it looks like when some Japanese people watch that video of Brock saying that, this video that I made showed up as a recommended video. It showed up in like the next video in the autoplay. Like, you know how YouTube has that autoplay feature where if you just let it go, after one video, it'll automatically start playing the next video. And this was the next video that played after that Brock video. And that Brock video probably has over like 10 million views, or maybe even more. And so I think that's the reason why it ended up having 2 million views, is that it just, due to the algorithm being random or whatever, it got lucky and it ended up being the next recommended video after this other famous Pokemon meme in Japanese. And there is a lot of engagement in it. Like, if you read the comments, there's actually a lot of pretty vulgar stuff where people are like, "Oh, wow, Misty's such a bitch. She should know her place. Like her job is just to like keep Ash sexually satisfied. That's her only job." And like a bunch of really crude stuff like that. And a lot of other people just saying like, "Oh man, this was disappointing. I thought it was going to be worse." And there's other people saying like, "Oh wow, if this like actually interested in like a social justice kind of way, like, oh wow, this, it's like, if this aired today, there would be such an uproar. This would never fly today. Like, yeah, Danjo Sabatsu is bad. Danjo Sabatsu is what's the English word for that? It's sexism. Yeah, sexism. It's like, yeah, sexism is bad. Like, I can't believe this. Like this would never fly today and stuff like that. So yeah, interesting to read the comments. And you'd think that I'd make a lot of money in that video because I have an ad on the top of the video, but I actually only make like $16 a month on it. I think because the video is so short, and in terms of advertising, YouTube really values long videos because they want people to stay on YouTube for a long amount of time. And so I guess because the video is only 19 seconds, even though that it gets tens of thousands of views every month, I only make like $16 a month from it. But yeah, but I keep it there because, hey, maybe some people will watch my other videos from that video, and hey, it's a free $16 a month, and there's no real reason for me to take it down, so I just keep it up there. But yeah, I think I uploaded that in 2013 or 14, and so that was before I really had any AJAT or Japanese learning videos on my channel. So and for the longest time, it had very few views. It was like 5 years after I uploaded it that it suddenly takes off. And it goes through periods where it gets more views and periods where it goes through less views. Like, for a while, it was getting like 50,000 views every single day. And then they'll go through a period where it only gets like 1,000 views a day. And so, yeah, the YouTube algorithm is super random. So, okay. See, actually, answering this question is always fun. I always say like, hey, okay, only one more. And then I just, it's you know, like when you're like, addicted to like eating cookies or something, you're always just like, okay, one more. That's actually sometimes how I feel when I'm answering these questions, but we'll see. So maybe 2 more, but at least one more now. So Cole McCannon asks, "Hey Matt, can you elaborate more on what types of words I should make cards for versus just look up and move on? I feel like I have a difficult time discerning this, especially when reading." So there's a very easy answer to this question. If you think that you might be able to remember it without making a card, then don't make a card. If you feel like you probably need a card to remember it, then make a card. So that's basically it. So now you might say like, well, what if I think I don't need a card to remember it, but then I actually forget it, and then I realize I do need a card for it? Well, if that happens, then just make a card for it later. So let's say you look up a word, you feel like, okay, maybe I'll be able to remember this without a card. And so you don't make a card and you move on. And then, like a week later, you come across a word, you look it up, and then you realize, oh crap, I looked this up last week. But, and I thought that I would remember it, but actually I didn't. Okay, well then you can just make a card then. You know, it's never too late. So, that's really the framework, is just, it'd be kind of a waste to use the SRS to learn a word that you would have learned anyway, or at least would have easily learned anyway. And so you want to, because, you can only make so many cards a day. Like, I only made 10 cards a day. Some people make more because they have more time or they have more capacity to handle more reps. But I always made 10 cards a day. And so for me, I always had to choose the best 10 cards possible, or the best 10 words possible to make cards into, so that I would be get the most bang for my buck. And so I would always try to choose the words that it seemed like I would need the SRS to remember, and leave the ones that I thought I could just remember anyway. And so later on, I'll get to the point where, or depending on how you immerse and stuff, like what sources you use, later on you might get to the point where you only come across like 5 new words every day. And so in that case, maybe you just SRS all of them, or maybe you SRS none of them. It all kind of depends on personal style. But in general, the framework is, you don't want to waste your time SRSing something you don't really need to. So just ask yourself, do you think you'll be able to remember it without, or easily remember it without the SRS? If the answer is yes, then don't. And if it turns out that you were wrong, it's never too late to learn it later, because anything that you really need to know will continue to come up, and you'll have multiple opportunities to learn it. So, okay, I think I might actually make this the last question. So Anime Godfather asks, opinion on LingQ app for language learning. So he's talking about Steve Kaufman's learning program LingQ. It's LING or LINKQ, and some people pronounce it LingQ. But if you actually listen to how Steve Kaufman pronounces it, he just calls it LingQ. So it's a paid online language learning website. It also has a smartphone app, and the way that it works in brief is that you import text content from your target language into the website, and then you read through the content on the website, and if you click on a word, you can instantly get the definition for it. And then every time you look up a word, the word becomes highlighted in a certain color, and the more times you look it up, then then like as you keep looking at words, the color, the like tone of the color gets darker and darker, or it like changes colors, and like it goes through the colors of the rainbow. And then eventually, once the word becomes blue, it means that you fully have learned it. And so basically, you look up a word the first time, and then the word's highlighted in a certain color, and then the next time you come across that word, it's still highlighted in that same color. So that just reminds you, oh, I've looked up this word before. And then that helps you try to recall it. And then if you look it up again, or you already remember it, then you can move it to the next color. So it's like this gradient of colors. There's like 5 different possible colors, and then the last one is blue, and that means you fully learned it. So if you look it up again, the next time you come across it, you can move it to the next color. And so overall, you just get more and more words through blue. So it has a built-in SRS as well, but it's like optional, and there's like no card customization. The cards are all automatically generated and stuff. And the real idea is that you're just learning through consuming text content. And this system of highlighting the words that you know and that you've looked up before is just supposed to kind of be a memory aid. And so, yeah, I think it has the potential to work. It obviously works for many people. It's personally not my style. My style is more just making SRS cards. But ultimately, they're both similar things, right? They're just different ways of stimulating your memory. I think that LingQ might be good for beginners, because in the beginning, you're learning very common words that are going to come up all the time. And so this system, I think, might work pretty well for stimulating your memory and helping you remember common words. But I think it's going to break down once you're learning very uncommon words, because without the SRS, you're going to see them so infrequently that it might be hard to really nail them in. And also, it's kind of like a less organized system. Like with the SRS, it's a very organized, very controllable system, because there's an algorithm that's calculating when you should see your cards. Whereas if you're on LingQ, you're just hoping that you're going to come across it again in an organic way through consuming content. And so personally, I like the more controlled nature of the SRS, that I can have this feeling that it's almost like a guarantee that I'm going to remember something that I put in. And I think that ultimately you can learn faster with the SRS, but of course it has the downside of being less organic and more contrived. And some people just don't like that. Some people really hate the SRS, I think including Steve Kaufman. And so they just prefer the style of LingQ, the more organic style, where pretty much you're just consuming content. That's all you have to do. It doesn't feel like study. And so, yeah, the other downside is that you can really only learn through texts with LingQ. Now, I know there's like dialogues, and so like there's dialogues that have audio, or you could import the transcript of a YouTube video, and so you can listen to the audio for the text later, but you're still learning from text in the program, right? Like if you import the transcript of a YouTube video and then you're doing the LingQ, you're reading the transcript, it's reading. And then later you can listen to the YouTube video, yeah, but you're not really learning directly from reading. So I like to learn from target language subtitles. I think that's a really good way to improve your listening and reading at the same time and just jump into reading content that's above your level. And so right now you can't really do that with LingQ. But yeah, so I mean, obviously it's not my preferred way of learning. I don't use it for Chinese. I tried it, but it wasn't really for me. But clearly it works for some people, and ultimately it can still be used under MIA philosophy, right? Because MIA philosophy really comes down to immersion and spending time with the target language and how you spend time with the target language. And LingQ is just another way to easily engage from and learn from target language content. So if you use LingQ in the right way, I think it's totally compatible with MIA principles. Some people like Luke Truman, who I've interviewed on my main channel, uses LingQ and likes LingQ. So yeah, it might be something to look at. Personally, it's not my style, but clearly it works for some people. So yeah, that is going to be it for this week's Q&A. Thanks so much for watching. Thank you so much for supporting, and I'll see you guys soon.